This week, Washington grappled with two ongoing crises, the COVID-19 pandemic and the fallout from the insurrection against the United States Congress and the peaceful transfer of power. Law enforcement officials testified with more details about what happened on January 6th. And in his confirmation hearing, Attorney General nominee Merrick Garland discussed the threats this country faces. Here's some of what we saw this week.
I will supervise the prosecution of white supremacists and others who stormed the Capitol on January 6th.
How could you not get that vital intelligence on the eve of what's going to be in a major event?
What? Thank you, sir. I know that's something that's going to be looked at.
Do you believe that what happened, the breach of the Capitol, did you believe that's foreseeable and predictable?
No, I don't.
The department was not ignorant of intelligence indicating an attack of the size and scale we encountered on the 6th. There was no such intelligence.
As House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and top Democrats push for a commission to look into the attack, some congressional Republicans are denying basic facts, including the legitimacy of the 2020 election and questioning whether the rioters who stormed the building supported Trump at all. Can Washington come together on the facts of this attack when those facts are being challenged? Joining us tonight are four reporters covering this story. Susan Davis, congressional correspondent for NPR and co-host of the NPR Politics podcast. Errin Haines, editor-at-large for the 19th. My colleague Mark Mazzetti, Washington investigative correspondent for the New York Times. And Ashley Parker, White House bureau chief for the Washington Post. Mark, you wrote a very smart piece this week looking at the missing 2 hours, the attack on January 6th. What did we learn this week about the security breakdown and what happened on that day?
Well, we learned some elements that filled in a little bit of that picture. So we know that the chief of the Capitol Police, Stephen Sund, on that day at around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, right as the crowd was breaching the barricades, made an urgent request for the National Guard, the DC National Guard. That request was not fulfilled for 2 hours, almost 2 hours, and the Guard didn't show up for hours after that. We know that Chief Sund put a request into the House and Senate sergeants at arms who delayed actually fulfilling that request. And even after they fulfilled it, the Pentagon took some time to actually decide whether to do it or not. What we kind of saw in that hearing that you showcased earlier was kind of an exercise in deflecting blame. The security officials were blaming the intelligence. Chief Sund was saying that his urgent requests went unfulfilled. We have yet to hear from what the Pentagon said. But what is pretty clear, Peter, is that there was nobody, whether it's intelligence, the FBI, the Capitol Police, the DC Police, Capitol officials, nobody was screaming, raising alarms in the days before the events, signaling that this could possibly happen. I think that's pretty clear.
Errin, we learned a lot this week, but what do you think we didn't learn? If you were put in charge of the investigation, what would be the most important question you would want to have answered at this point?
Well, Peter, I think that you have to note just the discrepancy between the way that these insurrectionists were perceived, the perceived threat of these insurrectionists, who we know were largely white, largely male. What their perceived threat was, that this was not something that was forwarded up to the highest levels of law enforcement, that they were not mobilized and galvanized against this threat that was widely known about, frankly, before January 6th, compared to some of the law enforcement response that we've seen or anticipated law enforcement response we've seen to the largely peaceful Black Lives Matter protests that we've seen in the past few years. What does that mean? Is there a racial dynamic to that? I think that is something as a country that we are still grappling with. It's certainly something that a lot of the folks in the activist community that I talk to speak about, especially when we know that our federal government has said that white supremacy, that extremism, that is fueled by this white nationalism, is the greatest threat to our national security. If that is the case, why was that not treated as such headed into and on January the 6th?
Yeah, Susan, it's interesting. A lot of Republicans might not agree with that at this point, right? Ron Johnson, the senator from Wisconsin, voiced some pretty interesting ideas that this was actually the work of left-wing agents provocateur and fake Trump protesters. We also saw a poll this week that said that 58% of Trump voters actually believe that the protests, that the riots were mostly an Antifa-inspired attack that only involved a few Trump supporters. Now, obviously, that's not true, and we've heard from the FBI and others, and we all saw the video. So what's up with that, Susan? What's going on with that kind of conspiracy mongering there at a Senate hearing?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. One, Ron Johnson, I think, speaks only for Ron Johnson. I think in the broader context of that hearing, the Senate has gotten a fair amount of credit this week. It is, at least so far, and granted, it's only been one hearing, but so far this has been a bipartisan effort by Republicans and Democrats that run the Homeland Security Committee and the Rules Committee. All accounts from all of the senators running this thing is that they're doing it together, that they don't want it to devolve into sort of a conspiracy theory or partisan fight. And I think it's a sharp contrast to what's happening in the House, which is very much that equation. The House has not scheduled really any similar oversight hearings to what we've seen happening in the Senate. There is almost no bipartisan effort to try to get to it. And we're seeing a big partisan fight right now over this question of a 9/11 style commission, something that would be bipartisan, that would be established by the Congress, but essentially taken outside of the Congress, to have an outside independent body look into what transpired, both leading up to the events of January 6th and on that day. And that's going to be really tough to come by. There's some disputes over whether it should be, how it should be split. Should it be split evenly between Republicans and Democrats? Should Democrats have an advantage on it? And the scope of that investigation. I think that there's a lot of Republicans who are resistant to it because, as we saw through the impeachment process, there's a real resistance to any kind of inquiry that could lead back to Donald Trump and his role in the events of January 6th. I've talked to Republicans today who think that Democrats have a resistance to a commission that could look at the security failures that happened on that day, because Congress is run by Democrats right now and would make them look like they weren't prepared for this attack on their watch. So it's quite different than the climate after 9/11, where the Congress and the country really came together. The 9/11 Commission was passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. This is a very different event. January 6th did not have the effect of unifying Congress and bringing Democrats and Republicans together. In fact, I think it had quite the opposite. We've seen complete fracturing between the two parties, most acutely in the House, and almost no goodwill to work together to get to the root causes of why that event happened.
Ashley, as Susan just mentioned, President Trump sort of haunts over this, former President Trump, and you know, his role is one that continues to be of great consequence to this inquiry. But the current president, Joe Biden, wants to move on, right? As you wrote this week, he wants to not talk so much about the former guy, as he called him. But Senator Ted Cruz told the Conservative Political Action Conference today that, quote, Donald J. Trump ain't going anywhere. So when we hear from the president at this conference on Sunday, a conference of conservative activists, what do you expect to hear, Ashley? Do you expect him to say anything about the January 6th attack? Do you expect him to announce he's running for president again in 2024?
Well, you never know which version of Donald Trump to expect. So my answer comes with sort of the usual Trump caveat. But the truth is, you know, whatever version you see, there is that version where he sticks to the teleprompter. We have seen that. He is capable of reading words off of a teleprompter and delivering an on-message message. That's not, if I was predicting what I am expecting, Donald Trump is also someone who sort of loves these, CPAC, of course, is not a rally, but he loves these rallies. He loves these crowds. When he was on the campaign trail and in the White House, his aides often thought of it almost as a boiling teapot where he had to get out, get that energy, let off that steam. He has been largely cloistered away at Mar-a-Lago. So you would expect this to be, if history is any guide, one of these moments where he does sort of really try to rally that far right base crowd of his. And no matter what version we see, I think the other thing that is important is whether he announces he potentially plans to run, he is going to position himself, and in many ways correctly so, as the leader of the Republican Party still. And you have to look no further than Senator Cruz, who you just mentioned, the sorts of panels we're seeing at CPAC now, the sort of sense of grievance politics and victimization, or even look at someone like Leader McConnell, who has basically said publicly and privately he wants to move past Trumpism. He's said to aides he doesn't want to ever speak to Donald Trump again. His wife resigned from Donald Trump's cabinet in the wake of the January 6th attacks. And earlier this week, when asked on Fox News if he would support Donald Trump if he did happen to be the Republican nominee in 2024, Leader McConnell said, absolutely. That's where the Republican Party stands right now. And that's the Donald Trump will emerge leading that sort of party on Sunday.